Alright, so in this video I'm going to go through two of the most common types of test that you'll see in my videos, and I call them the flow test and the visual test. Now we're going to get into both shortly, but one thing is you have unit tests and integration tests that people generally talk about. And we also have end-to-end tests and regression tests, obviously, but the point of this video is to demonstrate a few things. First of all, the two tests that I just mentioned, but also why I don't like the term integration test, why it can be confusing. Because I'll just say it right away. When you have a unit test, it is pretty straightforward. You have a pure function that you test, and you test for a certain outcome. You give it certain inputs, and you see the outputs, and you validate whether the outputs are expected. That's just common stuff. Now, when you have a React application, you don't just have pure functions, you have components. And when you have components, you have to deal with more complex functionality. The component has state, the component has DOM elements, and the component has business logic. It's not just a bunch of pure functions that make up a component. So because of this, you might end up wanting to look up how to test React components, and you might come across some integration tests for it, for example. Some unit tests and integration tests. Integration test is how I see it, it's a very foggy word. A lot of people don't know what it means, and it could encompass a wide variety of things. Now, the point of this video is to break down what we're actually testing for. And I've come up with my own names. So we have the flow test and we have the visual test. So let's start with the flow test first. Now the flow test, let's just get right in on this one. So right here, the flow test, it validates that our code is flowing as expected. Now when I say flowing, when code flows, it means, how I think of it at least, is certain actions and functions are being called. That's it. So we have a flow test right here, and you can test for not just two scenarios, but any number of scenarios. But I put 2 here because 2 is the basic number for which we can see how this test functions. So under scenario 1, you see, I validate that function A was called and function B was not called. Now under scenario 2, I validate that function A was not called and function B was called. You'll see this kind of test over and over again in a lot of my videos. In fact, I've linked one up top here, but basically these are the kind of tests that you would do when you want to, let's say, validate that a certain function was invoked, a spy. You want to use a spy in that case. You might also want to validate whether a certain Redux action was dispatched, if you're using Redux, that is. So these are called a flow test. And also, if you're testing your backend, you also want to validate whether certain backend functions were called and certain functions were not called. This is just based on what the user has passed in, let's say, in a request. If the user makes a specific GET request with specific parameters, and your function has logic that invokes other functions based on those parameters, well, this is the kind of test you're doing. You're doing a flow test, whether everything flows correctly, whether the functions are being called, the actions are being dispatched, and in the case of Redux sagas, that too, whether all of the, in this case, functions are being called and actions are being dispatched. You'll see this over and over again when it comes to testing either your components or your backend API controller, let's say. So that's your flow test right here. We also have a visual test. Now, a visual test is pretty simple. It is what I'm seeing on the screen as expected. Now, once again, we have 2 scenarios here, and you can have more than 2. But the point of breaking it down into 2 is to give you a framework to think about how to organize these tests. So under scenario 1, I verify that element A, for example, is visible and element B is not visible. And under scenario 2, it's just the opposite. Element A is not visible, element B is visible. Now, a realistic scenario of doing this, and I've linked a video up top here that I've done of a visual test, but you might want to validate that when you click on a certain button, a certain element is in the the DOM, let's say, is in the document, and a certain element is not in the document. Something else is if the user has certain credentials, let's say the user is so-and-so member, if you have a membership-based application, if the user is a certain member, you might want to show certain data, you might want to hide certain data. And this is a visual test. Now, this, keep in mind, you can have both visual and flow tests that encompass the same functionality. For example, a visual test, with the example that I just said, if a user is able to see certain data and not able to see certain data, perhaps that's a visual test. But along with that, certain functions will be called and certain functions will not be called. So it's also a flow test. So if you can break every test down into this kind of framework, what are you testing? Are you testing the flow or are you testing the visual? Are you testing whether a function was invoked or are you testing whether the DOM has what it should be having? So these are two ways to think about it. Again, these are not the only test frameworks. I'm saying outside of your regular unit tests, this is how I view any testing, especially of React components, especially of sagas, and especially of Node Express controller code, let's say. So that's that.